Esther Vale sat in her wedding gown and did not flinch. The Dowager Countess reached across the breakfast table, flicked a single sugared crumb toward her plate, and murmured 2 words. The trades portion. A crumb. Nothing at all. And it stung like the flat of a hand. Then the old woman rose before 60 seated guests. She lifted her glass. "My son, the Earl, has gone and married a grocer's girl." The room laughed behind their gloves. Esther kept her eyes level. She did not weep. At the foot of the long table, a grey-headed solicitor set down a small black box sealed with a ram's head. He unclasped it half an inch. And there he waited. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who should have looked closer, this story is for you. Before we go any further, do one thing for me. Subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with the town you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels tonight. Now, let us begin at the beginning, where all of this was already true, and no one at that table knew it yet. Her name was Esther Vale, and she was 23 years old on the morning she married an earl. She had not been raised to it. She had been raised behind a counter. Her father was Josiah Vale, and if you had gone looking for him 20 years before, you would have found him at a market stall in Nethergill, in the North Riding of Yorkshire, weighing loose tea into paper twists with his own 2 hands. He wore no gloves. He kept no airs. He rose in the dark, and he swept his own step, and he learned every man's name in that market before he learned anything else. He rose. That is the plain word for it. From a stall to a shop. From a shop to a warehouse that took in tea and sugar by the chest and sent it out again across 3 counties. And he did it, they all said, by one thing only: fair dealing. He never shorted a scale in his life. He never sold a bad chest as a good one. When a poor woman counted her coins twice at his counter, he looked away to spare her the shame, and then he gave her the better weight anyway. Men trusted Josiah Vale. That was his fortune in the end. Not the money. The trust. He died in the spring of 1877. He left his daughter everything: the warehouse, the ledgers, the good name, and he left her one small thing that mattered more to her than all of it. His seal, a ram's head cut deep in brass that he had pressed into hot wax on every honest contract of his working life. She kept it wrapped in a square of felt, and he left her something else. A small brass counterbalance. You have seen its like. A little weight, no bigger than a plum, that a grocer sets against his scale to true it before the day begins. Josiah had used that one for 30 years. Esther set it on her writing desk the week he was buried, and there it stayed. She would rest her hand on it sometimes, cold and smooth and heavy, the way another woman might touch a rosary. "So I never weigh a person wrong," she said once, when Edmund asked her why she kept it. "He taught me that. You put the true weight down first, then you know what a thing is really worth." Edmund Thornbury, Earl of Harrowgate, 26 and Lord of Ravenscarne Hall, though the title sat on him a little large, the way his father's coats had before they were taken in. He met her over an account. That is the ordinary truth of it, and Esther never dressed it up. The hall owed her warehouse money. A long account, tea and sugar and candles and spice, run up over years and left to drift the way such things drift in great houses that are grander than they are solvent. Someone had to come and settle it, and the young Earl, new to his troubles, came himself. He thought it beneath a lord to send a steward to a grocer's office, so he came, expecting to be kept waiting. He was not kept waiting. He was shown straight in to a plain room with a plain desk, and behind the desk sat a young woman with ink on her finger and her father's ledgers open in front of her, and she looked up at him with a pair of steady dark eyes and told him, to the shilling, exactly what his house owed and exactly how long it had owed it. He did not know it that day. But that was the moment. He came back the next month. He said it was about the account. It was not about the account. He came back the month after that and by then they both knew it was not about the account. He walked with her along the river at Nethergill, where the mills turned. He told her things he had never told the polished daughters of polished houses, because Esther listened the way her father had listened, with her whole attention, and gave a plain answer to a plain thing. She warned him she was honest to a fault, and she warned him what she was. "You are a grocer's daughter," she said, "and I keep books, and I know what your mother will say." "Let her say it," he answered. Easy words. He would learn how hard they were to keep. They married for love. Whatever came after, hold on to that. It was not a bargain, not a rescue, not a climb. He loved the woman who trued her scales, and she loved the man who had come to her office expecting nothing and left with his whole heart handed over. They married in the autumn of 1879 at Michaelmas, when the leaves were turning gold above the North Riding and the wholesale year closed its books. And now, before we go on, the narrator will tell you one thing plainly, because you have a right to know it before they do. Long ago, before Esther was even born, her father Josiah Vale bought something. He bought it quietly, and he paid a great deal for it, and he never spoke of it again. He bought a piece of ground. And of all the ground in Yorkshire he might have bought, he bought this ground. The ground under Ravenscarne Hall itself, the very earth beneath that proud old house. Nobody at the wedding breakfast knew it. Not the laughing guests, not the Earl, not even Esther cared to think of it that day. And the Dowager Countess of Harrowgate, who was about to call the bride a girl who owned nothing but her apron, would learn precisely what her new daughter owned. She would learn it at Michaelmas. Keep that word. Michaelmas, now to the house. Ravenscarne Hall stood grey and long against a grey and long sky, near the little village of Nethergill, where the moor came down almost to the garden wall. It had stood 300 years. It had the look of a place that had always been rich and had lately learned to pretend it still was. The portraits were dark with age, the plate was heavy, the chairs were old and good, and the woman who ruled it all was Adelaide Thornbury, the Dowager Countess, 58, straight as a poker and about as warm. She had one belief above all others, and she held it the way some people hold their faith. Blood told. Breeding told. A thing was worth what its name was worth, and a name was a thing you were born to, not a thing you earned. Trade was a stain. Money that smelled of the counter was dirty money, however much of it there was. She had married into an old title, and she had spent 30 years defending its walls against exactly the sort of person her son had just brought home. She smiled at the wedding. It was the worst thing she did all day, that smile. And then the campaign began. It began small, the way these things do. On the first evening the new bride sat down to dinner in her own new home. Esther found her place laid at the very foot of the table. Below the salt. There is a phrase you may not know, but the older guests knew it, and it did its work. Above the salt sat family and honour. Below the salt sat the servants' betters and the poor relations, the people you were obliged to feed, but not obliged to notice. The Dowager had put the Countess of Harrowgate below the salt at her own board. Esther saw it. She took her place without a word. The Dowager watched her eat, and halfway through the soup, in a voice pitched to carry the length of the table, she said, "Not like that. Child, we do not tip the bowl toward ourselves. Away, always away. But then, one cannot know these things unless one is taught them young." A pause. In the right house. The footmen kept their eyes down. A cousin tittered. Esther set her spoon aside, quietly, and folded her hands, and said, "Thank you. Away, I shall remember." She was not stupid. She knew a lesson in soup was not about soup. But she had decided something already, in the first hour under that roof, and she held to it. She would not make Edmund choose between his wife and his mother at his own dinner table. She would swallow it. She had her father in her. You put the true weight down first, and you keep quiet. And you let the day tell you what a thing is really worth. That was Esther's blind spot, though she would not have called it one. She thought silence was the only dignity a woman like her was allowed. She thought if she simply bore enough, gracefully enough, it would one day be enough. She was wrong about that. But she was not wrong to be kind. The second wave came with the flowers. Esther loved a particular flower, sweet william and marigold, and the tall bright things that grow in a cottage garden and a market square, the flowers of the people she came from. She had cut them herself and set them through the hall, in the good vases, to make the great cold rooms feel like somewhere a person might live. She was proud of them. It was the first mark she had made on the house. She came down the next morning, and they were gone. Every one. In their place stood tight little arrangements of hothouse lilies, white and waxen and scentless, the flowers of a funeral more than a wedding. The housekeeper, Mrs. Hartley, would not meet her eye. Her ladyship's instruction, my lady, was all she would say. And then, because the old woman had made her repeat it, and she was ashamed, she said the rest of it. Her ladyship said the others were shopkeeper's blooms, my lady, not suitable for the front of the house. Shopkeeper's blooms. Esther stood in the hall a moment. Then she said, "They are very pretty, the lilies." "Thank you, Mrs. Hartley, it's no matter." And she went up to her own small sitting-room, where a jar of her sweet william still stood on the sill, and she looked at it for a long time, and she did not cry, and that was almost worse. The third wave was cleverer, and it was the one that went wrong. The Dowager decided the marriage should simply be undone at the root. Not annulled yet, not openly, not while the ink was wet and the county watching. But eased apart. She would send the young couple abroad, the Earl to travel, the bride to be quietly kept somewhere far and small, and in a year or two the thing would loosen and could be cut. And to arrange it properly, in writing, with money, she sent for a solicitor. Now here she made her error, and she made it out of pure arrogance, and it is the first thread of the whole matter, so mark it well. She sent for a man named Mr. Alaric Pettigrew. He was near 60, dry as a stick, grey from his collar to his crown, precise in every word. And the Dowager believed him to be the family's man, the estate's own solicitor, her instrument. She had seen him about the old business of the house for years, and she had never once troubled to ask on whose behalf he actually came. She summoned him to the morning-room. She told him, crisply, what she wanted drawn up. A settlement, a yearly sum, an arrangement to remove the grocer's girl gently and permanently from the running of Ravenscarne. She spoke to him as one speaks to a servant one trusts, and Mr. Pettigrew listened to every word with his hands folded on his black bag, and when she had finished, he did a small thing that changed the temperature of the room, though the Dowager did not feel it yet. Esther had come in during the speech, quietly at the far door, to fetch a book. Pettigrew rose. He turned from the Dowager Countess, who had been giving him his orders, and he crossed the room and he made his bow, not to the great lady in her chair, to the young woman by the door, a deep, correct, unmistakable bow, the bow a man gives to the person he serves. "My lady," he said to Esther, "I am glad to find you. There are matters of your father's estate that will want your hand before long." The Dowager Countess sat very still. Something had gone wrong with the shape of the room, and she could not yet name it. The solicitor she had summoned to remove this girl had bowed to the girl first, and had called her father's estate a thing of consequence, and had all but ignored the great lady who had rung the bell. If you have been paying attention, you know more than the Dowager did in that moment. The old man had shown his hand without meaning to. He did not take his instructions from Adelaide Thornbury. He never had. Keep that. It is the first confirmation of a thing you already suspect. Esther, for her part, wanted no scene, and she moved to smother the moment before the Dowager could catch its meaning. "Thank you, Mr. Pettigrew," she said quickly. Another time, there's the wedding still to see through. But Pettigrew, dry and dutiful and entirely deaf to the politics of the thing, added one more sentence, low, almost to himself, as he gathered his bag. There is the Michaelmas business of the ground, my lady. It falls due. I would not have it lie past its term. The ground, there it was, said aloud in a morning room, the whole of it, hiding in plain sight in 6 flat words. And Esther, wanting only for the old man to stop, to sit down, to say no more in front of her husband's mother, waved it away with the very carelessness of someone to whom it truly was nothing. The ground rent is nothing, she said. Let it lie. And it lay. For now, you and I know what he meant. She, in that instant, was thinking only of a small yearly sum, a formality, a scrap of business her father had left half-finished. She did not weigh it. She had a wedding to survive and a husband's peace to keep, and she set the whole matter down unregarded. The way you might set down a plain brass weight without knowing it is the truest thing on the table. The Dowager Countess heard the ground rent is nothing, and was satisfied and thought no more of it. She thought she had won the room. She thought the solicitor had merely muddled his bow, as old men do. She went back to her plans with her certainty entirely whole. That certainty was going to cost her everything, but not yet. First came the breakfast. The wedding breakfast was the great public event of the whole affair, the thing the county would talk of for a year, and the Dowager Countess had determined that if she could not stop the marriage, she would at least brand it. She would fix, in front of 60 of the best people in the North Riding, exactly what this bride was and exactly what she was not, so that no one, ever, could pretend to forget it. They gathered in the long dining room under the dark portraits. 60 guests, in silk and broadcloth, the men who owned the moors and the women who ruled the drawing rooms. Esther sat in her wedding gown at her husband's side, and she was, if you had cared to look, the handsomest woman in the room, dark-eyed and straight-backed and calm, but almost no one there cared to look. They had come to see the grocer's girl in the Countess's chair, and they were ready to be amused. It came near the end, the dishes cleared, the glasses filled, and first, before the words, came the crumb. You saw it at the start. The dowager reached out with one thin finger and flicked a single sugared crumb from the cloth toward Esther's plate, and murmured, so that only the near guests heard and understood, and passed it along the table in whispers, the trade's portion, as if to say, there, that is your share of the sweet things of this house. A crumb. Take your crumb, grocer's girl. Esther looked at the crumb on the white cloth. She did not touch it. She did not answer. And then the Dowager Countess rose to her feet and lifted her glass, and the room fell quiet for the toast, and she gave them what they had come for. My son the Earl, she said, has gone and married a grocer's girl. The laughter came at once, that low laughter behind gloved hands, the cruelest sound there is, because it does not even bother to be angry. It was amused. 60 faces turned toward Esther to watch her colour, to watch her flinch, to enjoy the small wet shine of shame in a girl's eyes. There was more. The dowager was not finished. She let the laughter settle, and then she said the line she had built the whole day around, the branding iron itself, slow and clear, so that every soul in the room could carry it home. A grocer's girl, she said, owns nothing but her apron. She merely stands in a countess's house. Owns nothing but her apron. She merely stands in a countess's house. Remember every word of it. Every word. Because there is a day coming, in this story, when each of those words will be handed back to the old woman one at a time, and she will have to stand and hear them, and there will be no laughter behind any glove then. But we are not there. We are here, in the long dining room, with 60 people watching a bride to see if she will break. She did not break. Esther Vale sat with her back straight and her eyes level, and she did not weep, and she did not answer, and she did not so much as let her lip tremble. But under the table, in her lap, hidden in the folds of her wedding gown where no one could see, Her two hands closed around a small, cold, heavy thing. She had carried it down with her that morning without quite knowing why. Her father's brass counterbalance. The little weight he had trued his scale with for 30 honest years. She held it in her lap while the Countess called her worthless, and she felt its true, plain weight in her palms, and she thought of a man in an apron who had never shorted a scale in his life, and she was not ashamed. That was the thing the Dowager could not understand, standing there in her triumph. The girl was not ashamed. You cannot brand a person who is not ashamed. The iron finds no purchase. Her father's own scales held in her grip at the very moment they called her nothing. Hold that picture. It is going to matter more than you can guess. At the foot of the table, unremarked in all the laughter, the grey solicitor, Mr. Pettigrew, set down a small black box, sealed with a ram's head in dark wax. He rested one hand upon its lid. He did not open it. He only waited, and watched the bride hold her father's weight in her lap, and something that might, on a warmer face, have been sorrow moved behind his spectacles. He knew what was in the box. He was the only one in that room of 60 who did. The breakfast broke up. The guests drifted off to their carriages, well pleased, carrying the good story home. And the marriage, 3 days old, was already cracking down its middle. Because now Edmund had to choose, and Edmund could not. This was his weakness, and it is only fair to name it as we named his mother's. He was not cruel. He loved his wife truly. But he wanted two things that could not both be had. He wanted Esther, and he wanted his mother's blessing, and he kept believing, against all sense, that if he only waited a little longer, was only patient a little longer, both would somehow come to him. He waited too long. He very nearly waited past the point where the right to choose is taken out of a man's hands altogether. That night he came to Esther. Wretched, she had no right, he said. I'll speak to her. I'll make her take it back. But even as he said it, his eyes slid away, and Esther, who read people the way her father had, saw that he did not know how, that he was a boy in his own house still, and that his mother had ruled him for 26 years and would not stop over a breakfast toast. And the Dowager pressed her advantage without mercy. In the days that followed, she worked on him steadily, in corners, on stairs, over the tea she poured with her own hand. Annulment. It was not too late. The thing could be undone. Quietly. The county need never dwell on it. And he could marry properly, and the stain would wash out of the bloodline as though it had never been. She did not shout it. She dripped it. Day after day. Blood tells, Edmund. You owe it to your name. You owe it to your father's memory. You cannot found 3 more centuries of Harrowgate on a warehouse in Nethergill. And Edmund said nothing to stop her, and his silence was its own kind of answer, and Esther heard it through the walls of that cold house, as plainly as if it had been shouted. So she made her decision. And here is the true measure of the woman, the thing you must understand before everything turns. She decided not to fight. Not because she was weak, because she loved him. She looked at it squarely, the way she looked at a column of figures, and she reasoned it through. If she fought, she would win only by shaming his family before the whole county, by dragging the ancient name of Harrowgate through a public quarrel, by making Edmund choose against his mother and hate himself for it forever after. And she would not do that to him. She would sooner be thought a grocer's girl to the end of her days, sooner bear every crumb and every toast and every stripped-out flower than expose her husband's house to the world's laughter. I will not be the ruin of him, she told herself, alone in her small sitting room with her father's brass weight cold in her hand. Let them think what they like of me. I know what I am. He knows what I am. That is enough. It was a kind of nobility. It was also her blind spot, whole and entire. She still believed that silent endurance was the only dignity open to a woman in her place. She did not yet know that she held in her own 2 hands the power to end the whole cruelty with a single word, lawfully, quietly, and forever. She did not know, because she had never troubled to weigh a thing her father had called nothing. But the man who did know was already on the road to tell her. Mr. Alaric Pettigrew came to Ravenscarne again 3 days after the breakfast, and this time he came not because the Dowager had rung a bell, but because the calendar had turned. It was Michaelmas, and something that had waited 21 years for this exact season had at last come due. He asked, very correctly, to see the Countess of Harrowgate. He meant Esther. The servants, confused, showed him to her small sitting room, the one with the sweet William on the sill. He came in, and he bowed, the same deep correct bow as before, and he set down upon her writing table, beside her father's brass counterbalance, the small black box sealed with the ram's head in dark wax. Esther looked at it, and for the first time she looked at it properly. She saw the seal. She knew that seal. She had it wrapped in felt in her own drawer, the twin of it. A ram's head cut deep in brass, her father's own mark, pressed into that wax by her father's own hand years and years ago, before she was born. "Mr. Pettigrew," she said slowly, "that is my father's seal." "It is, my lady." He drew a chair and sat, without being asked, which was itself a kind of message, and he folded his dry hands on the lid of the box. "I was your father's solicitor for 30 years. I am now yours. Everything I did for Josiah Vale, I do now for his daughter, and for no one else in this house, whatever her ladyship the Dowager may suppose. I have let her suppose it. It was not my place to correct her. It is, however, very much my place to tell you what you own, before you are foolish enough to sign it away for love of a family that has used you like a scullery maid at your own wedding." Esther's hands had gone quite still in her lap. "I heard what she called you," Pettigrew went on, and his dry voice did not rise, but something under it had gone hard and old and cold as the moor in winter. "Owns nothing but her apron, merely stands in a countess's house." He paused. "My lady, your father made me swear an oath before he died that I would keep this business exactly to the letter, discharge it exactly at its term, and put it into your hands and no others. Michaelmas has come. The term is up, and so I have kept my oath and brought it to you, and now, with your leave, I am going to open this box, and I am going to tell you a thing that your father did in the year 1858, 20 years before he ever heard your husband's name. He reached out and unclasped the ram's head seal. The lid rose an inch. Inside, folded and old and tied about with faded green ribbon, lay a document, and along its top edge, in a clerk's fine copperplate hand, Esther could just read the first line before the old man's fingers stilled upon the page, holding it a moment longer from her sight. It read, "An indenture of Freehold, concerning all that ground whereon stands Ravenscarne Hall." And Mr. Pettigrew looked up at her over his spectacles, and he said, very quietly, "My lady, sit down. What your father owned, what you now own. It is not the rent. It was never the rent." Esther sat. She did not remember deciding to. Her knees simply gave way to the old man's voice, and she came down onto the little hard chair by the window, and the jar of sweet William on the sill trembled with the movement, one bloom nodding as if it too leaned in to hear. Mr. Pettigrew smoothed the document flat upon his knee. The green ribbon he laid aside with the care a man gives a thing he has kept for 20 years. Then he began to read, and he read the way he must have read to her father, plainly, without hurry, letting each word carry its full and lawful weight. "This indenture," he read, "made the 3rd day of November, in the year of our Lord 1858. He glanced up. "20 years, my lady, before you were a woman grown, between the Right Honourable the Earl of Harrowgate of the one part, and Josiah Vale, merchant of Nethergill in the North Riding, of the other part." "My father," Esther said. Her voice came out very small. "Your father." He returned to the page. Whereas the said Earl, being at that time pressed for a sum of ready money, and being seized of the freehold of all that ground whereon stands his mansion house called Ravenscarne Hall, did agree to sell, and did sell, the whole of that ground and soil to the said Josiah Vale, his heirs and assigns for ever, for the sum of £8,400, paid in full and acknowledged. The clock on the mantel went on with its small dry work. Outside, on the moor, a curlew called once, and was still. "Sold it," Esther said. "Sold it. The ground. The soil. All of it." Pettigrew turned the sheet a quarter and read the last of it. The said Earl reserving to himself and his heirs the use of the said ground under a lease of 21 years, at a rent, the term to run from Michaelmas 1858. He folded the paper closed. 21 years, my lady. Counted from that Michaelmas. She understood him before she let herself understand him. And this Michaelmas was 3 days ago. He set the deed in her hands. It was lighter than she had thought a thing so heavy would be. The lease is spent. The ground beneath this house is yours, in law, absolute and unencumbered by their tenancy. They live here now, my lady, at the freeholder's pleasure, and the freeholder is you. For a long moment Esther did not move. She had come to this house a grocer's girl. She had been seated below the salt and told how to hold a spoon. She had watched a housekeeper carry her flowers out of the room like something spoiled. She had stood in a gown she had chosen with such care, while a woman with 300 years of name behind her lifted a glass and made the room laugh. And all that while, under the very floor where they laughed, under the stone and the cellars and the long cold roots of the place, lay ground her father had bought and paid for with the honest earnings of a tea and sugar warehouse. She looked down at the deed. She thought of the brass counterbalance on her writing desk. "So I never weigh a person wrong. He never told me," she said. "He told me to tell you. At Michaelmas, not before." Pettigrew's dry face softened by some small degree. "I think he wished you to marry for love, my lady, and not to go into a great house knowing you held the ground from under it. He wished it clean. Whatever came, he wished it clean." Esther pressed the heel of her hand to her mouth. When she took it away, her voice was steady again, in the way her father's had been steady over a ledger that would not come right. "Then I shall keep it clean," she said. Pettigrew tilted his head. "My lady, you will draw me a lease." She rose, and she set the deed down upon the little table, and she laid her palm flat upon it, as a woman lays a hand upon a Bible. "A new one. From me, the freeholder, to my husband the Earl, and to his heirs after him, of all this ground, for ever. At what rent? A peppercorn." She looked at him. 1 peppercorn a year, if he ask for it. Nothing, if he does not. In perpetuity, Mr. Pettigrew, it is not to be undone, not by me, not by any that come after me. Their home is theirs. I will not have Edmund lie awake one night of his life fearing the roof over his mother's head. The old solicitor did not move for a moment. Then he took off his spectacles, and he polished them slowly upon a square of cloth from his waistcoat, and Esther saw that his hands were not quite still. 30 years I served your father, he said at last. He would have done exactly that, and told no one. He put his spectacles back on. You are very like him, my lady, and it is not the counterbalance you are like. Draw it, Esther said, and I will sign it before another soul in this house knows there was ever a deed to sign. He drew it that same afternoon, at the little desk in her sitting-room, dipping the pen and forming the words in the same fine hand that had served her father 30 years. A perpetual lease of the ground beneath Ravenscarne Hall, from Esther, Countess of Harrowgate, to Edmund, Earl of Harrowgate, and the heirs of his body, at the yearly rent of 1 peppercorn if demanded. When it was done, she read it through once, slowly, the way she had been taught to read a thing before she put her name to it. Then she took up the pen and signed. Esther Vale, she began, and stopped and smiled a little, and finished it, Esther Harrowgate, because both were true. Pettigrew sanded the ink and folded the sheet and slid it into his black box, and pinned behind the indenture the second sheet he carried, the one he had not yet spoken of. He said nothing of that second sheet. His instructions were to keep the whole matter to the letter, and to the letter he kept it. "There," Esther said. "It is done, and no one is the poorer, and no one is shamed. Let it lie quiet, Mr. Pettigrew. Let it lie forever." It would not lie quiet a week. Adelaide Thornbury had watched the old solicitor bow to the wrong woman, and it had lodged in her like a splinter under a nail. She was a woman who had ruled Ravenscarne for near 40 years, and she knew the taste of a thing out of its proper order, and this was out of its proper order. A grocer's girl, and the family's own man of law inclining his grey head to her first, and going up to her sitting-room with his box, and coming down with his box, and saying to the Dowager Countess when she stopped him on the stair, only, "Her ladyship's business, madam, is her ladyship's," in a voice as shut as a strong-room door. She misread it entirely. She thought it insolence. She thought the shopkeeper's daughter had got the solicitor to draw some grubby settlement of her own, some clutching at pin money and jointure, and meant to make herself hard to be rid of. And that decided her. "He is bought," she told Edmund, in the long drawing-room where the light came thin through the tall windows. "Your father's own man, bought by a warehouse. Do you see now what she is? She schemes with lawyers behind your back while you moon over her like a boy." Edmund, look at me. This marriage must be undone, and quickly, before she has roots in this house that we cannot pull." Edmund stood at the window with his back to her. He was 26, and he loved his wife, and he loved his mother, and he had not yet learned that a man cannot serve two loves who have set themselves at war. "She has done nothing," he said. "She has done nothing yet." Adelaide crossed to him. "Send them away. Send them abroad, the pair of you, and let the thing be quietly annulled while you are gone. Or send her away alone. I care not which. But she does not stay in this house past Michaelmas, do you hear me? I will not have trade under this roof at Christmas. Michaelmas is past, mother, then she goes the sooner." Adelaide turned from him. "I have written to the solicitor myself. He will produce the documents of this house before he is a day older, and I will show you, and I will show her, and I will show every soul that laughed at my table, exactly whose ground she stands upon." She did not know how true that was. That is the cruelty of a proud tongue, that it so often speaks the very thing that will hang it, and hears only its own music. The near discovery came 2 days after. A housemaid, tidying Esther's sitting-room, found the black box left out upon the desk, and being a good girl and a curious one, remarked upon the seal to Mrs. Hartley, the housekeeper, who remarked upon it in turn, in the way of a great house where nothing is ever wholly private, until the word of it reached the Dowager Countess as she took her morning chocolate. "A seal," Adelaide said. "What seal?" "A ram's head, my lady, wrapped in a bit of felt. The lawyer's box, they do say." A ram's head. Adelaide set down her cup. Something moved in the deep cold cellars of her memory, something from long ago, from the year she had come to this house a bride herself, when her husband the old Earl had sat late over his papers with his face grey, and would not say what troubled him, and there had been letters that came and went, and a merchant's man, and upon the merchant's letters a seal she had seen only once or twice, and had thought, at the time, an odd device for a tradesman. A ram's head. She had asked her husband what it meant, and he had folded the letter over and said, "Nothing that need trouble you," in a voice that had ended the asking. She sat very still with the memory a moment. Then she pushed it from her, because she was Adelaide Thornbury, and no shopkeeper's box was going to make her uneasy in her own morning-room. "Fetch it here," she said. "It is gone, my lady. The lawyer took it away again this morning, said he'd be back for the gentlefolks leaving, to see the last of the guests off proper." Did he? Adelaide's mouth thinned. She thought, he means to make some show of it. He means to stand up before them all with his box and his settlements, and press some claim of hers. Very well, let him bring his box. She would meet it in front of every witness that had sat at that table, and she would put the grocer's girl out of Ravenscarne before their eyes, and there would be an end. She sent word to the guests who lingered, the ones who had come far for the wedding and stayed on for the shooting, 60 near enough of them still under the roof. She sent word to Mr. Pettigrew, she sent word to her son. Assemble in the great hall, the morning of the departures. There is a matter of the house's title to be settled, and settled publicly, that no doubt shall remain who is mistress here. And Esther, when Edmund told her of it, white about the mouth, said only, then let her have her assembly. She would not stop it, she would not stand up and cry out that she held the freehold, and shame him before his friends, and unmake his mother in front of 60 pairs of eyes. She had signed the peppercorn lease to keep his home safe. She would keep his pride safe too, if silence could do it. She thought silence could do it. It was her one great blindness, that she believed enduring quietly was the whole of dignity, and she carried it right up to the door of the great hall. The great hall of Ravenscarne was a long stone room hung with 300 years of Thornburys, dark oil faces in gilt frames, and a great table down the middle of it, where the wedding breakfast had been laid 3 days before. The same 60 guests came in by 2s and 3s, murmuring, half of them delighted at the promise of a scene, for a great family quarrel is the finest sport a country visit affords. The florid gentleman who had led the laughter at the breakfast came in among the first and took a chair near the head of the table, well placed to see. Adelaide stood at the top of the room, beneath the largest of the portraits, her late husband the old Earl in his robes. She wore grey silk and her mother's diamonds, and she looked, Esther thought, coming in upon Edmund's arm, like a woman who had never once in 58 years imagined she might be wrong. "Come in, come in," Adelaide said, and her voice carried the length of the stone. "Sit, all of you. You have been my guests at a wedding. Be my witnesses now at a small setting to rights." Her eye found Esther and rested there, cold and bright. There has been some confusion in this house of late as to who holds it, and who stands in it only on sufferance. I mean to end that confusion this morning, before you all, with the papers of the house to speak for me. She turned. "Mr. Pettigrew, you have kept us waiting. Produce the documents of this house." Mr. Alaric Pettigrew came up the length of the great hall with his black box under his arm, and he set it on the long table, and he did not hurry. He set it down where the light from the tall windows fell full upon it, and the ram's head seal in its felt caught the light, and Adelaide saw it plain, and again something moved in the cold cellar of her memory, and again she put it from her. "You are the estate's solicitor," she said. "You will tell these good people the family's ancient right in Ravenscarne, and you will tell them who is mistress here." "I am not the estate's solicitor, madam," Pettigrew said. "I never was. I was Josiah Vale's solicitor these 30 years, and I am his daughter's now. But I will very gladly tell these good people the family's right in Ravenscarne. It is a matter of record. It is why I have brought the record." A little stir went round the room. Adelaide's chin lifted. "Then read it," she said, "and have done, with her ladyship's leave." And Pettigrew looked, not at the Dowager Countess beneath the great portrait, but down the room at Esther, who stood by the door on her husband's arm. And Esther knew, in that moment, that she could stop it with a word, and that she had left it one breath too late, for the old man had his instructions to the letter, and the letter had come. And there was a kind of terrible mercy in his eyes that was not asking her leave so much as telling her that the thing was now past any leave of hers to give. She said nothing. She folded her hands. Pettigrew unclasped the ram's head seal. The lid rose. He drew out the old deed with its faded green ribbon, and he untied it. And he laid it flat upon the table where all could see it was no fresh forgery, but a paper gone brown at its edges with 21 years. This indenture, he read, and his dry voice filled the stone room to its rafters, made the 3rd day of November, in the year of our Lord 1858. Between the Right Honourable the Earl of Harrowgate of the one part, he paused. The late Earl, madam, your husband, and Josiah Vale, merchant, of Nethergill, of the other part. The room had gone very quiet. The florid gentleman leaned forward, whereas the said Earl, Pettigrew read on, being at that time pressed for a sum of ready money, did sell to the said Josiah Vale, his heirs and assigns for ever, all that ground and soil whereon stands this mansion house of Ravenscarne, for the sum of £8,400, paid in full and acknowledged. He let the figure stand in the air a moment. £8,400, reserving to himself only a lease of the ground of 21 years from Michaelmas that same year. Somewhere down the table a wine-glass was set down too hard upon the wood. 21 years, Pettigrew said, from Michaelmas 1858. He looked up, and he looked at no one but Adelaide now. That lease expired, madam, at Michaelmas last, 3 days ago. As of that morning, the freehold of the ground beneath this house, the ground beneath this very floor, beneath these chairs, beneath the feet of every soul in this room, stands absolute and unencumbered in one owner, and that owner is not the Earl of Harrowgate. He set his hand flat upon the deed. In law, the family of Thornbury hold Ravenscarne now as tenants, and the freeholder, the landlord of this house, is Josiah Vale's heir. Is his daughter. His voice did not rise. It did not need to. Is Esther, Countess of Harrowgate, whom you seated below your salt. The silence that fell was the deepest Esther had ever heard. It was not the silence of a room surprised. It was the silence of a room rearranging itself, 60 people all at once understanding that the floor they sat upon was not the floor they had thought, and turning, slowly, every one of them, to look down the length of the great hall at the grocer's girl by the door. Adelaide had gone the colour of the grey silk she wore. That is a forgery, she said, but her voice had lost its stone. That is some cheat got up by a warehouse and a bought lawyer. It is your husband's own hand and seal, madam, and witnessed, and it has lain in my strong room 21 years untouched. You are welcome to have it examined by any man of law in the riding. Pettigrew did not so much as blink. But I have not finished. There is a second matter. Your ladyship bade me produce the documents of this house. There is one more. He turned the deed over, and behind it, pinned, was the second sheet, and he unpinned it now. When the late Earl sold this ground in 58, he said, it was, as the deed says, because he was pressed for ready money. I will tell these good people plainly what pressed him, for it is written in the account, and the account is part of the record. It was debt, madam, debt of honour. Gaming debt. £8,400 went to quiet it, and Josiah Vale's money quieted it. And this house stood on through the winter of 58 because a Nethergill grocer paid the Earl of Harrowgate's card losses. Adelaide's hand had found the back of a chair, and that was not the whole of it either, Pettigrew went on, relentless as a man reading a bill. A portion of the debt could not be met even so. It was carried. It was made a charge, a mortgage, not upon the ground this time, for the ground was gone, but upon the movable contents of the hall itself. Upon the plate. Upon the pictures. He lifted his dry old face and let his glance travel, once along the dark oil portraits in their gilt frames, 300 years of Thornburys looking down. Upon these very chairs, madam, that your guests are sitting in. That mortgage was never redeemed. It stands to this day. In law, the furnishings of Ravenscarne, the plate off which you dined, the diamonds are your own, madam, I make no claim there, but the chairs, the portraits, the great table this deed lies upon, are charged still to the estate of Josiah Vale. You have lived these 21 years upon trade's ground. and you have sat upon trade's forbearance." The florid gentleman looked down at the chair beneath him as though it had grown warm. Adelaide Thornbury stood beneath the portrait of her husband, and she gripped the chair back with both hands now, and no one spoke. No one needed to speak. 3 days ago she had lifted a glass in this same room and told 60 people that a grocer's girl owned nothing but her apron and merely stood in a countess's house. Now the 60 people sat in the grocer's chairs, on the grocer's ground, and the silence gave her back her own words more cruelly than any tongue could have thrown them. She opened her mouth. She had ruled by her voice for 40 years, and she found, for the first time in her life, that there was nothing in the room that her voice could move. And it was then that Edmund crossed the floor. He had stood frozen at the threshold through all of it, a man watching two loves burn, unable to run to either. But a man cannot stand at a threshold forever. The reading had reached into him and settled the thing his own heart had been too gentle and too torn to settle for 3 days, and he let go of nothing so much as he simply chose, at last, and the choosing moved his feet. He walked the length of the great hall, past the staring guests, past his mother at the top of the room, and he came to Esther by the door, and before them all he took her hand in both of his. "Forgive me," he said, low, "but the stone carried it. I should have crossed this room 3 days ago." Esther looked up at him. "You have crossed it now," she said. And down the table the florid gentleman, who had led the laughter at the breakfast, who had thrown back his head and shown his fine teeth while the room laughed behind its gloves, found that he could not lift his eyes to the grocer's girl at all, but sat looking at his own hands upon the trade's own table. Then Pettigrew spoke once more, and his voice had changed. It had lost its bill-reading flatness. It had gone quiet, almost gentle, the way a man's voice goes when he comes at last to the part of a story he is glad to tell. "There is one document more," he said, "and with this I have done. It is not old. It is 3 days old. It was drawn in this house, in her ladyship's own sitting-room, on Michaelmas afternoon, an hour after I laid the freehold before her and told her what she owned." He drew the last folded sheet from the box. Before ever this assembly was called, before her ladyship the Dowager Countess had spoken one word of putting anyone out of anything, before the new Countess was owed, by anyone under this roof, the smallest particle of gratitude, he unfolded it. "It is a lease," he said, "from Esther, Countess of Harrowgate, freeholder, to Edmund, Earl of Harrowgate, and to the heirs of his body, of all the ground beneath this house, for ever, at a rent." He looked up, and something almost like a smile touched the dry corners of his mouth. "At a rent of 1 peppercorn a year, if it be demanded, and if it be not demanded, at nothing at all." A sound went round the great hall, a soft broken sound, 60 people drawing breath at once. "She held the whole of your home in her 2 hands, Pettigrew said, on the very afternoon she learned she held it. She could have put you out by Michaelmas, madam, as you meant that morning to put her out. Instead she sat down at her little desk, and she gave it back. All of it. For a peppercorn, for nothing. To her husband, and to his heirs, in perpetuity, so that no Thornbury after this day need ever lie awake fearing the roof. She did it in silence. She meant that you should never know. It is only your own summons to this hall, madam, that has forced it into the light. She would have let you go on calling her a grocer's girl for the rest of her life, and kept your house safe under you the whole while, and told no one." Esther's face had gone hot. "Mr. Pettigrew," she began. But it was too late for silence now, and everyone in the great hall was looking at her, and their faces had none of them the look they had worn 3 days before. Adelaide Thornbury stood at the top of the room and stared down its length at the girl she had branded, and for the first time in the whole of her proud life she seemed old and small and uncertain of the ground. And Esther, because it had to be said once and never again, let go of Edmund's hand and walked a little way up the great hall toward the woman beneath the portrait, and she spoke. She did not raise her voice. Her father had taught her that you never need raise your voice when the figures are true. You said I owned nothing but my apron, Esther said. You said I merely stood in a countess's house. She stopped. I own the ground you stand upon, ma'am. I have owned it since before you knew my name. And I have already given it back to your son. That was all. She did not gloat. She did not press it. She turned and went back down the room to her husband and took his arm again, and the thing was finished. Adelaide Thornbury left the great hall alone. No one went with her. She walked the whole cold length of it under the 300 years of painted faces, and out at the far door, and the guests parted to let her by, and did not meet her eye, and that was the last that the wedding company saw of the Dowager Countess. Within the week she had removed herself to the dower cottage at the park's edge of her own accord, and asked for nothing, and was granted quietly by Esther's own order every comfort she had been used to. That is nearly the end of it. But you will want to know how it stood a year on, and so I will tell you. It was spring at Ravenscarne, the spring of the year following, and the honey light of a Yorkshire April lay along the old oak panelling of the great study by the tall windows. On the great writing desk there, where a succession of earls had done their accounts for 300 years, stood a small brass counterbalance, worn bright at the beam with handling, a grocer's tool from a warehouse in Nethergill. Esther kept it there now. So I never weigh a person wrong. She had need of it, for she ran the house herself these days, openly, and ran it as her father had run his trade, by fair dealing and a true reckoning, and the servants had learned that the grocer's girl paid her people honestly and to the day. And there was not one of them would have gone back to the old way for a pension. The freehold was hers. The home was safe. She had seen to it that the peppercorn lease was entered and recorded and could never be undone, so that Edmund and the children they might one day have would hold Ravenscarne unafraid for ever. And in the little drawer of the great desk lay the ram's head seal, wrapped in its felt, her father's and now hers. The Dowager Countess took her tea in the dower cottage now. She kept a good garden there, they said, and read a great deal, and was very civil to the tradespeople who called, uncommonly civil, and was careful these days, exceedingly careful, whom she called trade. She and Esther met at church and at Christmas, and were courteous, and if it was never warm between them, it was never cruel again. And once, at that first Christmas, the old woman had said, stiffly, over the tea in the great study, "The house is well kept," and Esther had answered, "Thank you, ma'am," and neither had said more, and that was as near to peace as the two of them ever came, and it was near enough. As for the florid gentleman who had led the laughter, he sent a card that Christmas, engraved and handsome, with a warm word in it about calling when next he was in the riding. It lay in the little drawer of the great desk beside the seal, unanswered. It is there yet. Some doors, once a person has laughed at you through them, you are under no obligation to open again, and Esther, who forgave a great deal, saw no reason to trouble the pen over that one. She sat at the desk that April evening with the light going gold on the panelling and her hand resting, as it often did, on the cool worn brass of her father's balance. Outside, the moor ran on to the edge of the sky, and the curlews were calling, and somewhere below in the house a door opened, and Edmund's step came along the passage, unhurried, coming to find her, as he always did now. A name, you see, is bought at a font. It is given to a child that has done nothing to earn it, and carried by grown men and women who sometimes do nothing to deserve it. But worth is a different coin. Worth is earned at a counter, over a true weight, by fair dealing done in the plain light of day, year on patient year. The one may look down on the other for 300 years, but the ground remembers. The ground always remembers who paid for it, and that is the story of the grocer's girl they called a countess in mockery, and who turned out, in the end, to own the very earth beneath their mockery and to give it away for love, which is the finest thing a person can do with any fortune at all. If you have listened this far, I should love to know where you are listening from. Comment the town you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has travelled.